Rome was one of the greatest empires in history, and at its peak, it covered a vast area of approximately 5 million square kilometers. It was a civilization that dazzled the world with its roads connecting distant lands, massive amphitheaters, squares adorned with sculptures, and magnificent public buildings. However, behind this grandeur lay the relentless expansion of Rome's famous legions, constantly shedding blood for more land and manpower. Cities, towns, and villages fell one by one under the unstoppable power of Rome. Yet, there are those who dared to resist Rome, even some who had the courage to invade it. This is their story. The people of Clusium, an Etruscan city, woke up to a spring morning filled with shock and fear. Beyond the city walls stood a massive crowd, raising their swords and shouting terrifying war cries. No one knew who these foreign warriors were or where they came from, but one thing was certain. The man leading them was a dangerous figure who refused to negotiate. His goal was to take the city, plunder it, and then continue southward toward Rome itself. That man was Brennus, one of the chieftains of a Senan's tribe. He had crossed the Alps and in northern Italy around 400 BC. He was tall, with wavy hair, sharp facial features, and broad shoulders, appearing as a true Celtic warrior. He was ambitious, passionate, and above all, patient. He had spent much of his life listening to stories about the wealthy cities of central and southern Italy. According to historians like Livy and Plutarch, these stories were filled with tales of wine, beautiful women, and fertile lands. One of these legendary cities was Rome. Brennus had learned much about its inhabitants from these tales. He knew they lived in abundance and wealth, but he had also heard that they were not to be trusted. When Roman envoys arrived, Brennus sent them a message. "We have known of your existence from the very beginning, but you have only now learned of ours." At that time, Rome was not yet the vast empire it would later become. But when nearby cities were threatened, Rome was often the first place they turned to for help. The Romans knew they had to take this threat seriously. However, they were hesitant to enter another war. They had just emerged from a decade-long, exhausting conflict, leaving their army weakened and their economy in turmoil. The citizens were tired of fighting. Yet, abandoning Clusium to its fate would have been a strategic and political disaster. After all, Clusium was only 120 kilometers, 75 miles, from Rome. A growing power in northern Italy was now dangerously close to Rome's borders. Many Roman leaders believed they needed to stop this advance, but they were in no rush. After much debate, the Senate decided to send a diplomatic mission led by Quintus Fabius Sanga. Fabius belonged to the prestigious Fabian clan, one of Rome's most influential families. His father, Marcus Fabius, was the city's chief religious authority, and his brothers were key figures in Roman politics. Under his leadership, the Roman delegation set out for northern Italy to meet with the Senan's chieftains. But before their journey, Rome had already sent a few spies to Clusium. When the Gauls heard of the approaching Romans, they temporarily halted their attack and agreed to negotiations. However, Brennus was not a man who easily compromised. The discussions kept reaching a deadlock. From his perspective, the Senans were merely seeking new lands and opportunities. Clusium had plenty of fertile land, but its people refused to share it with the Gauls. If they were unwilling to compromise, Brennus believed he had the right to take everything by force. Quintus Fabius quickly realized that negotiations were pointless. He decided to take matters into his own hands. Instead of maintaining peace, he began inciting Clusium's citizens to resist the Gauls. Worse still, he actively participated in skirmishes between the two sides. During one of these clashes, Quintus killed a Gallic chieftain. This reckless action would have severe consequences for both Rome and Quintus himself. Brennus was furious. He immediately sent an ultimatum to Rome. "Give us Quintus's head as payment for the blood that has been spilled." This event escalated tensions between Rome and the Gauls, setting the stage for one of the most significant conflicts in ancient history. The fate of Rome was now at stake. Most sources state that many in Rome demanded the surrender of Quintus. However, the envoy had a significant number of allies in Rome, and in the end, they emerged victorious. Quintus was not surrendered. Moreover, one of his brothers was appointed as a tribune as a reward. This development signified that the war axes had been drawn. Brennus lifted the siege of Clusium. To avoid being struck from behind, he spent a few days convincing the local population that he was not their enemy. Now, his sole target was Rome, and he would not find peace until he reached it. As he marched south, no city, town, or village opposed him. Everywhere he went, he declared that Rome was his only enemy and sent messengers to reassure the local population. Finally, the two armies met near the Allia River, just a few kilometers from Rome. According to historian Livy, the Romans were completely unprepared for this battle. They had neither dug defensive trenches nor secured water supply routes, nor had they formed a proper battle formation. The center of their army was weak, while inexperienced soldiers were placed on the flanks. Their attempt to extend the flanks to avoid encirclement only worsened their position. When the battle began, all Brennus had to do was send his cavalry against the weakened flanks and continue the assault until the Roman lines collapsed. That day marked one of the bloodiest battles in Roman history. When the clashing of swords finally ceased, 2/3 of the Roman army lay lifeless on the battlefield. The fortunate few who managed to escape barely reached the waters of the Tiber River. The Gauls had secured a sudden and extraordinary victory. It was not easy for them to shake off the intoxication of this triumph. In the following days, they followed their traditions by looting the bodies of fallen soldiers and cutting off their heads. The corpses of those who drowned in the river were retrieved and stripped of their belongings. After several days filled with wine and revelry, Brennus finally decided to march on Rome. Throughout the journey, he remained on high alert, expecting an ambush. However, the road to Rome was eerily silent. This silence persisted even as they arrived at the city before sunset. According to historian Livy, the Gauls found Rome's gates wide open. The Romans had fled. Many had taken refuge in the Capitol Hill along with the city's treasures, while others had escaped to rural areas or neighboring cities. Suspecting a trap, Brennus chose to spend the night outside the city. He positioned his forces between Rome and the Allia River and ordered his men to observe the city throughout the night. However, there was not a single movement. Rome had become a ghost town, abandoned by its inhabitants. At dawn, convinced that the Romans had fled in fear, Brennus ordered his men to plunder the city. The Gauls entered through the northern Collina Gate. At first, they wandered aimlessly, encountering no one. According to Livy, the first Romans they came across were the patricians who had not sought refuge in the capital. These Roman senators awaited the Gauls in their homes with remarkable composure. They wore their finest and most magnificent garments, their faces exuding an almost divine majesty. According to Livy, this impressive sight left the Gauls in awe. At first, they hesitated to approach, believing the figures before them to be statues or deities. However, one of them finally gathered enough courage to stroke the beard of a Roman senator, Marcus Papirius. In response, Papirius struck him on the head with his ivory staff. At that moment, the Gauls realized that these were not divine beings, but mere mortals. The first to be killed was Papirius himself. Soon after, the other patricians met the same fate. Their homes were looted and then set ablaze. Within a short time, Rome became a blazing inferno, with smoke rising high into the sky. Brennus wanted the flames to grow even higher, hoping that this would force those hiding on Capitol Hill to abandon their stronghold in a desperate attempt to save their city. But it did not happen. The Romans were determined to hold their ground. The following day, the Gauls launched an assault on Capitol Hill. The fighting was brutal for both sides. The Gauls suffered heavy losses, but managed to push the Romans back from their positions. By evening, Brennus ordered a controlled withdrawal of his troops and prepared to lay siege to the hill. However, the siege would last much longer than he had anticipated. The Romans lacked the strength to drive the Gauls out of the city, while the Gauls failed to capture Capitol Hill. This relentless struggle dragged on for 6 months. The Romans occasionally managed to break through the siege to gather food supplies, but the amount they could procure was insufficient to sustain everyone on the hill. Meanwhile, the Gauls had to venture outside the city frequently to find food for themselves. The situation was precarious for both sides. Amid this uncertainty, a solution was proposed by a Roman nobleman named Quintus Sulpicius. Quintus knew that what truly enticed the Gauls was Rome's wealth. The cities had no intention of settling in Rome. Their only goal was the Roman treasury, piled up on the Capitoline Hill. Therefore, they had negotiated with Brennus and agreed to make a large payment in exchange for the cities leaving the city. With this development, Sully seemed to be on the side of the city for the time being. However, this situation would soon change. A few days before Brennus and Sulpicius's meeting, many groups of cities had left the city in search of food and started plundering nearby towns. One of these groups besieged Arda, located in the south of Rome. The defenders, led by Allia, were a man who was very popular among the Romans. Camel was not an exiled general, but a talented strategist on the battlefield, a charismatic leader, and a passionate statesman who had difficulty restraining his ambitions. He had achieved great success in the wars against the Vae City. Nevertheless, he had been exiled by the Senate on the grounds that he had abused his position. Since that day, he had been living an exile life on the island of Harbai. One day, one of the cities he had sent out to find food, by chance, reached this town, and a determined defense was organized under his leadership. The residents of Arda defended their town throughout the day. In the evening, under Camel Uslu's leadership, they made a raid on the enemy camp and killed them all. This event quickly spread throughout Lazio. The Romans, desperate to be saved, called their former commander for help. After securing his own interests, Amulus gathered a resistance force with the men he could find and headed toward the occupied Rome. When Amulus entered the city, Brennus and Sulpicius were negotiating the payment, as previously agreed. The Romans had measured the weight of the ransom with their own weights. However, the cities did not trust the Romans. For this reason, they brought their own weights and demanded that the payment be made based on these weights. This caused the disagreements between the two sides to flare up again. At that very moment, General Camel, drawing his sword, threw it at the scale and cried out, "Vis situs! Woe to the defeated!" What changed the conditions of the negotiations was the arrival of General Camel at the place where the talks were being held. Camel challenged Venus and announced that the agreement was invalid. Throwing the gold from the scale, he declared that only iron would be taken by Rome. This intervention meant the end of the negotiations. Now, for both sides, it was time to take up arms again. The cities and the Romans clashed with battle cries echoing off the city's walls. The streets of Rome were bathed in blood throughout the day. In this chaos, the first to be defeated were the cities. Camel's men caught them in the streets and killed them one by one. Brennus realized he was cornered and that he would soon lose his entire army. He ordered a retreat to the outside of the city in order to launch another attack, but it was too late. Most of the city's people did not get the chance to leave the city and were killed by Camel's men. Camel's victory was certain. Historical records use ambiguous terms about whether Brennus died that day or not, but most historians agree that he met the same fate as his men. Regardless, the one who came out victorious from these events was the exiled General Camel. He returned to Rome and began to be known as the second founder of Rome. Until his death from the plague in 365, he was elected dictator 5 times and continued to serve Rome as a soldier. Brennus never personally harbored any ill will toward Rome. What brought him into conflict with Rome was, in fact, history itself. The long migration movement of the cities from northern Italy to the south ultimately led to their paths crossing with Rome. Brennus' hatred for Rome was largely related to the political misconducts of the emissary and the actions taken during the Sulpans. On the other hand, the Romans had far more realistic and solid reasons to consider Brennus an enemy. Even centuries after Brennus' death, he would still be hated by the Romans. This was because he had entered their cities, looted their homes, burned their temples, and killed their people. He had damaged many things that were sacred to them. So much so that in the Roman calendar, the days of the Arian War and the day of Rome's sack are marked as unfortunate days. Yet, these events were a turning point for Rome. After the sack of the city, for the next 800 years, Rome would remain closed off to the invasion of foreign tribes.